You stupid, incompetent woman! You can't do anything right, my mother-in-law screamed, slapping me hard across the face in the middle of our large family dinner. Hearing that, my husband didn't defend me. Instead, he laughed out loud. I stood up immediately, threw the dirty porcelain plate against the wall, and said, "As of today, you have lost everything. I am divorcing you." And within exactly 1 hour, my husband's family business was completely destroyed. Before we dive into the story, please let us know in the comments which city or state you are tuning in from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can continue to grow and bring you even more fascinating stories. The atmosphere in the dining room of the lavish Crawford family estate in Westchester, New York, was filled with the clinking of heavy silver flatware against expensive bone china. That evening was a massive family gathering to celebrate the latest corporate milestone of the company, led by Vance Crawford. The massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling cast a brilliant light, illuminating the smug, arrogant faces of Vance's uncles, aunts, and cousins. They were all enjoying the luxurious catered feast spread across the long mahogany table, bragging about their stock portfolios, designer watches, and upcoming summer vacations to the Hamptons and St. Tropez. Amidst all the grandeur and raucous laughter, Sylvia stood quietly in the corner of the room near the serving buffet. She wore an incredibly plain, drab dress, her hair pulled back into a strict, unglamorous bun that made her look more like hired help than the lady of the house. Her hands were busy stacking dirty plates and ensuring the wine glasses of her husband's relatives were constantly topped up. As a wife, Sylvia had always chosen to keep her head down and serve with a devoted heart. She had cooked the entire multi-course dinner herself since the crack of dawn. The heat of the professional kitchen still clung to her skin. Yet, she endured the exhaustion just to maintain her husband's honor in front of his extended family. However, her sacrifices were never valued in their eyes. Condescending whispers could always be heard every time Sylvia walked by to clear a plate. Vance's cousins frequently sneered at Sylvia's conservative, outdated way of dressing, calling her a dowdy hick who was entirely unfit to stand beside Vance, who was currently recognized as one of the most successful young entrepreneurs in their elite Manhattan social circle. Sylvia heard every single insult with crystal clarity, but she chose to let them pass, replying only with a thin, polite smile. The climax of all these humiliations occurred when the main course, a delicate, piping hot lobster bisque, was served. Sylvia placed the large, steaming porcelain bowl directly in front of Eleanor. Her mother-in-law, who sat at the head of the table, glared at Sylvia with eyes full of disdain. Eleanor picked up her silver spoon and tasted a small amount of the rich broth. The moment the liquid touched her tongue, Eleanor aggressively threw her spoon down. It hit the china with a loud, sharp clatter that brought the entire dining room to a dead, sudden silence. All eyes were now fixed on the end of the table. Eleanor's face hardened, her lips curling into an incredibly condescending, cynical sneer. Without any warning, she stood up from her chair, raised her hand high, and swung it with all her might across Sylvia's face. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through every corner of the grand dining room. Sylvia's head was violently jerked to the side by the force of the impact. A burning, stinging pain immediately spread across her cheek, followed by a long ringing in her ear. Her body swayed slightly, but she managed to balance herself so she wouldn't fall to the hardwood floor. The silence in the room felt terrifyingly heavy for a few seconds before Eleanor's piercing voice finally shattered it. "You stupid, incompetent woman!" Eleanor bellowed, her voice booming. The veins in her neck bulged as she forced out her exaggerated rage. "This bisque is entirely too salty. Are you purposely trying to ruin my son's celebration? You are lucky my boy picked you up off the street. You should know your place and learn to serve your betters properly, not serve us garbage like this." Sylvia slowly raised her head. She did not cry. She didn't even touch the cheek that had just been struck. Her eyes immediately searched for Vance, the man who had sworn to protect her at the altar. Sylvia hoped her husband would stand up, intervene, or at least ask her to step into the kitchen so she wouldn't be humiliated any further. However, what she saw completely shattered the last remnants of patience she had so carefully maintained. Vance, sitting right next to his mother, simply leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair. He crossed his arms over his chest, looked at Sylvia with absolute disgust, and laughed out loud. Vance's laughter instantly triggered a chorus of cruel laughter from all the relatives in the room. They laughed at the sight of Sylvia standing frozen like a statue after being assaulted. "Mother is right," Vance said between his condescending chuckles. Her palate is completely unrefined. It makes sense. She was used to living in poverty before she married me. She simply isn't capable of cooking a meal fit for high-class people. Just let her learn, Mother. Consider it the price we pay for giving her a roof over her head. Her husband's words flowed like a torrent of daggers, shredding Sylvia's mask of patience. For the 3 years of their marriage, Sylvia had always compromised. She let herself be insulted, let herself be treated like a parasitic burden, purely because she wanted to know what it felt like to have a normal family. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the immense power she actually possessed. But tonight, Eleanor's slap and her husband's laughter woke Sylvia up to a bitter reality. They were never going to respect her. This family was filled with greedy, soulless monsters. The burning sensation on her cheek was suddenly replaced by an icy chill that rushed through her veins. Sylvia took a deep breath, calming the storm in her chest. Her eyes, which were usually dim and downcast, now sharpened, radiating an overwhelmingly dark, hostile aura. She took one step forward and picked up a heavy, dirty porcelain plate filled with food scraps from the table. Her hand gripped the thick china tightly. Without a shred of hesitation, Sylvia hurled the dirty plate as hard as she could against the dining room wall. The plate shattered into dozens of pieces with a deafening crash. Sharp shards of porcelain scattered across the expensive Persian rug, while leftover food stained the Crawford family's custom silk wallpaper. The laughter in the room stopped instantly. Everyone gasped in shock, shrinking back into their chairs. Eleanor's eyes went wide. She couldn't believe the daughter-in-law, who had always been as silent as a statue, dared to do something so outrageous. Vance jumped up from his chair, his face red with anger, ready to scream at his wife. But before anyone could open their mouths, Sylvia stared dead straight at her mother-in-law and her husband, alternating between them. Her voice sounded incredibly calm and flat, yet it harbored a lethal threat that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. "As of right now, you have lost everything," Sylvia said, emphasizing every single syllable. "Remember this slap and your laughter tonight very well, because starting from this exact second, your lives will be destroyed, leaving absolutely nothing behind." After delivering those words, Sylvia turned her back. She walked away, leaving the dining room without a single glance backward. The sound of her steady footsteps echoed down the hallway of the luxury estate, a home that would very soon become nothing but a bitter memory for this family. Behind her, Eleanor and Vance started laughing again. They assumed Sylvia's words were just the empty threats of a powerless woman throwing a temper tantrum. They had no idea that the sentence Sylvia just spoke was a death warrant of absolute destruction that no one in the world could revoke. The crisp night air hit Sylvia's face as she walked out of the towering iron gates of the Crawford estate. She walked with her back straight. There was not a trace left of the submissive wife whose dignity had just been trampled. At the end of the quiet, exclusive street, a long, sleek black Maybach SUV was already waiting, its engine purring. A man in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit quickly stepped out from the driver's seat, bowed respectfully, and opened the rear passenger door for Sylvia. The man was Liam, her personal assistant and most trusted right hand when it came to managing the affairs of her true corporate empire. Sylvia stepped into the luxury vehicle and sank into the plush leather seats. She untied the drab cooking apron that was still attached to her body, crumpled it up carelessly, and threw it onto the floor of the SUV. She pulled the tight pins out of her hair, letting it fall freely, and then pulled a high-tech tablet from a hidden compartment next to her seat. The screen displayed complex stock market movements, global supply chain graphics, and highly confidential financial reports. This was her real world. A world where she wasn't the stupid, incompetent woman her mother-in-law had screamed about, but Sylvia Sterling, the legitimate sole owner and CEO of Sterling Global Enterprises, a massive corporate titan that controlled critical economic sectors across the country. "Drive, Liam," Sylvia ordered, her tone ice cold. "Right away, Miss Sterling." Liam replied obediently, steering the massive vehicle away from the affluent neighborhood. He caught a glimpse of his boss's face in the rearview mirror and noticed the dark red bruise forming on her cheek. "Do we need to head to the hospital first to have that looked at, ma'am? Don't waste time on a minor scratch." "We have far more important things to dismantle tonight," Sylvia said, staring out the tinted window. Her memories drifted back to the early days of her marriage to Vance. She had hidden her true identity because she wanted to find a genuine partner. Someone who loved her without looking at her wealth and power. At first, Vance seemed like a hardworking man who loved his mother. Unfortunately, As time passed, Vance's mask slowly slipped. The man was obsessed with status, and his mother was a materialistic monster. The company that Vance and Eleanor were always bragging about had never actually achieved success through their own hard work. 3 years ago, the Crawford family business was on the verge of bankruptcy due to gross mismanagement. Sylvia, who had just married Vance, felt pity for him and decided to help her husband secretly. She ordered Liam to set up a series of shell companies and inject massive amounts of capital into Vance's failing firm. Not only that, Sylvia manipulated the market, directing massive corporate contracts and multi-million-dollar projects straight into her husband's lap. Over 80% of the total cash flow in the Crawford family business actually belonged to Sylvia. Vance merely acted as a puppet who genuinely believed he was a business genius, blind to the fact that his wife had paved every single road for him. Now, because they had dared to spit in her face and trample on her pride, Sylvia was going to take back everything that rightfully belonged to her. She was going to kick out the support pillars that kept the Crawford family standing so arrogantly. "Liam, it's time to act," Sylvia said calmly, breaking the silence in the SUV. "I have been waiting for this order for a long time, Miss Sterling." "Where should I start?" Liam asked. His hands swiftly tapped the dashboard communication console connected directly to their corporate headquarters in Manhattan. "Draft the divorce papers. Ensure there is no demand for alimony or asset division, because I am going to make his net worth plummet into the negative tonight. After that, contact every major bank that partners with his company. Order them to freeze all of the Crawford Company's operational accounts immediately, citing a sudden review of creditworthiness and a high potential for imminent default." "Understood, ma'am. I am contacting the bank directors right now," Liam said, typing a rapid series of commands. "Next," Sylvia continued, her tone growing even sharper, "pull all of our venture capital funding out, cancel every ongoing project, and unilaterally terminate all joint venture agreements. Let them bear the brunt of all the penalty fees for project failures. Call their main supply chain network as well. Inform them that Sterling Global will permanently cut business ties with any supplier who dares to send a single shipment to the Crawford Company." Liam nodded slowly. "That will grind their production to a halt by tomorrow morning. They'll have no raw materials, no cash to pay payroll, and no access to credit. Do you want me to pressure their stock on the market as well?" "Absolutely. Dump every single shadow share we hold in their company onto the open market at dirt-cheap prices. Create absolute panic. Make the valuation of that company worth less than garbage in record time. Destroy the Crawford family business. I am giving you 45 minutes from right now. Make sure that when the sun rises tomorrow, Vance and his mother realize they have been sent back to where they belong, the bottom of the abyss." Sylvia leaned her head back against the seat. The countdown to the total annihilation of the family that degraded her had begun. She had given them the world, and within the next hour, she would take it all back without leaving a single crumb. Sylvia's patience had run dry, and tonight, she would show no mercy whatsoever to the people who had dared to laugh at her suffering. Back in the dining room, the tense atmosphere that had settled after Sylvia's dramatic exit lasted only a few seconds. Eleanor sat back down in her chair with a harsh scoff. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her designer dress, which hadn't been messed up in the least. She glanced at the broken plate on the floor with utter disgust, as if it were a foul pest invading her magnificent home. Vance's uncles and aunts sitting around the table began to whisper, but shortly after, they went right back to their condescending laughter. They all assumed Sylvia's threat was just the empty boasting of a woman who was losing her mind after living as a charity case for too long. Not a single one of them believed that the quiet, submissive woman had the power to destroy anything, let alone a thriving corporation at the peak of its success. Vance raised his wine glass and invited all his relatives to offer another toast. He snapped his fingers at the actual maids to quickly clean up the mess on the floor and sweep away the scattered food. The conversation flowed heavily again, filled with praises for Vance, whom they viewed as the family's hero and primary wealth bringer. Uncle Bob proudly recounted how his business buddies on Wall Street constantly praised Vance's brilliant leadership. Aunt Susan wouldn't stop complimenting Eleanor for raising such a successful son, completely ignoring the fact that their daughter-in-law had effectively just been chased out of the house. They continued to party, enjoying rich, sweet desserts, completely unaware that a massive, dark cloud of absolute ruin was moving rapidly directly over their roof. Just as Vance was cutting into a massive celebratory cake, his smartphone, resting on the table, began to ring obnoxiously loud. The screen lit up, displaying the name of his chief financial officer. Vance smiled widely, assuming his CFO was calling to report on the record-breaking quarterly sales figures. He deliberately put the phone on speaker so his entire family could hear just how busy and important he was, even during a private celebration. But instead of hearing congratulations, the panicked, trembling voice that blared from the speaker instantly froze the smile on Vance's face. His CFO was hyperventilating, sounding like he had just run a marathon. He shouted Vance's name repeatedly, before he could even string a coherent sentence together. The executive reported that their primary anonymous angel investors, the shadow entities that had provided them with limitless funding for years, had suddenly pulled all their capital without giving a single reason. The massive withdrawal was executed unilaterally and instantaneously, draining the company's overflowing corporate coffers to absolute zero. Vance let out a nervous chuckle, trying to hide his rising panic in front of his extended family. He told his CFO to calm down and stop joking around, noting that a capital withdrawal of that magnitude couldn't happen outside of banking hours without prior lengthy notice. But the CFO started sobbing on the other end of the line. He swore on his life that it wasn't a joke. He read aloud the official, legally binding email from the investors, declaring the absolute severance of all ties, effective immediately. Before Vance could even process this insane information, another call beeped in, interrupting the CFO. This time, the name of the director of commercial banking from Chase, the bank that funded all of Vance's operational facilities, popped up. Vance's hands broke into a cold sweat as he pressed the accept button. The bank director's voice, usually incredibly warm and sycophantic, was now rigid and ice-cold. The director informed him that every single one of Vance's corporate accounts had been frozen that very night due to internal red flags indicating a massive potential for defaulting on maturing debts. The bank would begin seizing all collateralized assets the following morning if Vance could not immediately pay off a staggering, astronomical sum of debt. Vance's face turned pale as a sheet. He stood up from his chair, his entire body shaking violently. His uncles and aunts, who had been laughing just moments ago, were now struck dumb, exchanging confused and increasingly terrified glances. Vance tried screaming at the bank director, threatening to move all his financial portfolios to a competitor, but the call was abruptly disconnected. Cold sweat dripped from Vance's forehead. He frantically tried dialing his business partners for an explanation, but his phone rang again. This time, it was his chief operating officer calling from the main manufacturing plant in Ohio. With a voice full of despair, the COO reported that dozens of 1-8-wheeler trucks carrying essential raw materials had suddenly made U-turns at the gates, refusing to unload their cargo at the warehouses. The suppliers stated they were nullifying all contracts because they had received a severe warning from the ultimate market controllers. Without raw materials, the factory machines had to be shut down tonight, leaving thousands of workers confused and demanding answers about their jobs. The chaos in the dining room spiraled completely out of control. Vance threw his phone onto the table and grabbed his head with both hands. His breathing was heavy, his eyes bloodshot as he tried to hold back an overwhelming panic attack. Eleanor, who had been sitting in stunned silence watching her son scream, suddenly felt a tightness in her chest. Seeking a distraction, she grabbed the remote and turned on the large flat-screen TV in the corner of the room. She switched it to CNBC, desperately hoping to find some good news about her son's company to calm the room down. However, what flashed across the screen delivered the most lethal blow to Eleanor's sanity. The television displayed breaking news with massive red ticker tape scrolling rapidly across the bottom. The anchor, speaking with urgent intensity, reported that the stock of the Crawford family enterprise was suffering the worst flash crash in the history of the exchange. Their stock valuation was plummeting, hitting rock bottom due to a massive, aggressive sell-off by a mysterious major shareholder. The graph on the screen showed a harsh red line free-falling into an abyss. The company that just hours ago was being glorified was now officially declared completely worthless. Financial analysts on the broadcast were already concluding that the Crawford company was functionally dead and could not be saved. Eleanor let out a hysterical, ear-piercing shriek until her voice cracked. She clutched her chest, which was throbbing with sharp pain, and collapsed back into her chair with a vacant, hollow stare. Vance's aunts, uncles, and cousins, realizing that the luxury cruise ship they were all riding on had just struck an iceberg and was sinking fast, instantly changed their attitudes. Uncle Bob, who had just been singing Vance's praises, stood up and started cursing him out, demanding that a private loan he had given Vance be repaid tonight. Aunt Susan pulled her children away from the table as if Vance and Eleanor had suddenly contracted a highly contagious disease. Within minutes, all the relatives who had been happily kissing up to them were sprinting out the front doors of the mansion, leaving Vance standing paralyzed like a walking corpse. Amidst the ruins of his life and his mother's wailing, Vance looked up at the antique grandfather clock in the corner. The hands pointed to the exact time. It had been exactly 60 minutes since the sound of Sylvia's footsteps had faded from the house. Sylvia's parting words, demanding they remember that they would lose everything, now echoed in Vance's ears like a demonic curse that had become reality. The woman he had spent years treating as a stupid, useless peasant had actually manifested her threat in exactly 1 hour. Vance fell to his knees directly onto the sharp porcelain shards of the plate Sylvia had thrown, letting them cut through his trousers. His company, his immense wealth, and his towering pride had all turned to dust right before his eyes. The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the Crawford estate, but its light brought absolutely no warmth. The grand living room looked like a disaster zone. Reams of printed financial reports were scattered all over the hardwood floors, mixed with overturned crystal tumblers and rotting food. Vance sat slumped on an imported Italian sofa, looking utterly pathetic. His hair was a greasy mess. His bespoke shirt was wrinkled beyond recognition, and heavy, dark bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. He hadn't slept a wink all night. He had spent hours desperately dialing everyone he knew to beg for emergency bridge loans. But not a single person picked up his calls. The news of his spectacular, unprecedented bankruptcy was plastered across the front page of the Wall Street Journal and every major news network. In another corner of the room, Eleanor sat curled up, clutching her velvet jewelry box. Her eyes were swollen shut from crying nonstop. She kept muttering incoherent sentences while obsessively stroking her diamond necklaces and gold tennis bracelets. The reality that she was now a penniless woman burdened with insurmountable debt simply could not be processed by her fragile, arrogant mind. She blamed everyone for this disaster. She blamed rival companies. She blamed the federal government. She blamed her employees. And she especially blamed her daughter-in-law, whom she insisted had brought a vile hex into their home. Yet, deep in her heart, she vehemently refused to admit that any of this had anything to do with the curse Sylvia had spoken before leaving. To her, it was physically impossible for an uncultured, simpleton woman like Sylvia to possess the power to flip the entire world upside down in the blink of an eye. The heavy sound of approaching footsteps from the front foyer broke the agonizing silence in the house. A private security guard, looking highly uncomfortable, stood in the doorway and reported that a group of important guests was forcing their way in. Before Vance could even react, a group of stoic men in dark, razor-sharp designer suits marched into the living room, completely ignoring any pretense of politeness. They were top-tier Manhattan corporate litigators, men whose faces frequently graced the covers of legal magazines. The lead attorney stepped forward, placed his sleek leather briefcase on the messy coffee table, and glared at Vance with cold, calculating eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford. We are here acting as the official legal representation for our client, Miss Sylvia," the lawyer said, his authoritative voice booming through the room. Hearing Sylvia's name, Vance jolted upright. The anger he had been suppressing all night flared up again. He slammed his fist onto the table with whatever energy he had left, glaring at the lawyers. "That little bitch actually dared to send you here? Did she send you to mock my ruin? Tell her I'll make sure she regrets running away from this house. She isn't getting a single red cent of whatever assets I have left." Vance screamed, the veins in his neck bulging again. The lawyer didn't flinch at Vance's rage. Instead, he offered a very thin smile, a smile that conveyed both deep pity and profound disgust. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick manila folder bearing the scales of justice, and dropped it right in front of Vance. "You do not need to worry about the division of assets, Mr. Crawford. We are here to serve you with divorce papers from our client. Miss Sylvia is filing for a legal dissolution of marriage without claiming a single asset from you. She is fully aware that every single asset you currently hold, including this estate and your company, is entirely underwater and offset by astronomical debts. Our client has zero interest in taking on your deeply negative net worth." The lawyer's words felt like a physical backhand that sewed Vance's mouth shut. His trembling hands opened the folder, reading the dense legal jargon stating their marriage was being terminated immediately. At the bottom of the document was a highly detailed, devastatingly accurate, itemized list of his company's catastrophic losses information that shouldn't have been available to these lawyers so quickly. Vance let out a hollow, desperate laugh. He finally realized his wife had left him exactly moments before a Category 5 hurricane made landfall, ensuring she was legally untethered from his total financial collapse. Eleanor, hearing the conversation, scrambled up and rushed to the table. She literally spat on the legal folder with eyes full of hatred. That scheming whore! She must have known the company was going to have issues. That's why she picked a fight last night so she'd have an excuse to run. That ungrateful wretch. After we fed her and housed her for years, she bails the second we hit a rough patch. Eleanor cursed, her face turning purple. The lawyer completely ignored Eleanor's tantrum. He calmly packed up his briefcase, ready to leave. But before turning around, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, luxurious envelope detailed in gold foil. He placed the heavy invitation directly on top of the divorce papers. As a final act of charity, our client asked us to deliver this to you. It is an exclusive, non-transferable invitation to the annual Sterling Global Enterprises Gala tonight at the Plaza. She suggests you attend. Who knows? Amidst the hundreds of elite billionaires and titans of industry there, you might just find a new angel investor willing to shoulder your idiotic debts. That is, of course, assuming you still have enough dignity left to beg. After delivering that soul-crushing closing statement, the legal team turned and marched out of the house, leaving Vance and his mother frozen in place. Vance stared at the gold-embossed envelope with wide eyes. Everyone on Wall Street knew that Sterling Global was the undisputed king of the corporate world, the apex predator that could resurrect a dead company with a simple snap of its fingers. The CEO was notoriously secretive, but their power was limitless. Getting an invitation from Sterling Global was an impossible pipe dream for a mid-level player like Vance, let alone in his current, ruined state. A sudden, sick spark of false hope ignited in Vance's chest. He turned to his mother with a manic gleam in his eye, looking like a madman who had just found an oasis in the desert. Eleanor met her son's gaze, her breathing shallow. She wiped her tears, and suddenly, she straightened her back, her old arrogance returning. The sheer greed in her eyes burned bright again. They both rationalized that Sylvia's lawyers must have made a clerical error by leaving such a priceless invitation behind. Or perhaps it was an old invite that hadn't been delivered yet. Whatever the reason, they viewed it as their golden ticket out of hell. "Vance, we have to go to that gala tonight," Eleanor said, gripping her son's arm tightly. "This is our golden opportunity. Sterling Global can definitely provide the fresh liquidity we need to save the factories. Call Riley right now. Tell her to get dressed to the nines and wear all her best designer gear. We'll bring her along tonight. The CEO of Sterling Global will surely be impressed to see that we still run in high-class circles. We're going to prove to that penniless Sylvia that we can rise up and crush her under our heels again." Vance nodded with a burning, desperate enthusiasm. He immediately scrambled for his phone to call his mistress, Riley, ready to spin a web of new lies. The two of them began preparing, pulling out the best-tailored clothes they had left, masking their faces in fake arrogance, entirely unaware that the golden invitation was actually a one-way ticket to their own public execution. They were eagerly marching straight into the perfect trap set by the true master of the game. The iconic Plaza Hotel in the heart of Manhattan blazed with light that night, looking like a modern-day palace amidst the city gloom. A massive line of armored limousines and Maybachs snaked up to the main entrance, dropping off VIP guests consisting of high-ranking politicians, Wall Street titans, and global tech billionaires. Heavily armed private security personnel guarded every inch of the perimeter, ensuring no uninvited guests could step foot on the plush red carpet leading into the grand ballroom. Amongst the sea of luxury vehicles, a standard, slightly dented Blacktown car pulled up to the doors. Vance stepped out, holding his breath slightly. He was wearing the best Tom Ford suit he had left, trying desperately to conceal his pale complexion and the dark bags under his eyes from his sleepless night. Behind him, Eleanor stepped out with an arrogant strut, dripping in gaudy, oversized jewelry and a sequined dress that was far too flashy, deliberately worn to project the last remnants of her fake superiority. Accompanying them was Riley, the woman who had been Vance's secret mistress. Riley clung to Vance's arm flirtatiously, wearing heavy, dramatic makeup and a revealing haute couture gown, showing off what appeared to be incredibly expensive designer accessories. Eleanor smiled proudly at Riley's appearance, considering her the absolute gold standard of a woman fit for her son, a far cry from her boring, conservative ex-daughter-in-law. The three of them marched into the hotel with their heads held high, handing the gold foil invitation to the stern security director at the door. The guard eyed them with deep suspicion, likely because rumors of Vance's catastrophic bankruptcy had already flooded the Bloomberg terminals that morning. However, the official invitation forced the guard to unclip the velvet rope and let them into the unimaginably opulent ballroom. The venue was decorated with cascading crystal chandeliers that threw brilliant prisms of light everywhere. The polished marble floors reflected the silhouettes of guests sipping vintage champagne and engaging in hushed, powerful conversations. Round tables were draped in fine silk, adorned with massive centerpieces of rare orchids. Vance took a deep breath, mustering whatever courage he had left to try and approach some venture capitalists he knew. But every single time he tried to insert himself into a conversation, the men would immediately turn their backs or suddenly find an excuse to walk away. The news of his company's freefall and his mountain of toxic debt had spread like wildfire across the city. No sane investor wanted to breathe the same air as a man whose empire imploded overnight. Eleanor started getting hot and irritated, seeing the elite crowd actively ignoring her son. She grabbed Vance and Riley by the arms and dragged them toward a quiet corner near the hors d'oeuvre station. Grumbling under her breath, Eleanor blamed everyone in the room, calling them stuck-up snobs who didn't know how to recognize true talent. Right as she was complaining, her eyes accidentally caught sight of a woman standing not too far away. The woman was wearing a breathtakingly elegant, custom-made evening gown, paired with a sophisticated, perfectly matched silk headscarf draped gracefully over her shoulders. The fabric of the gown shimmered with hand-stitched diamonds that caught the light, radiating an aura of unimaginable wealth and exclusivity. The woman was conversing casually with a silver-haired senator who looked at her with utmost reverence. Eleanor narrowed her eyes, trying to place the incredibly familiar silhouette. When the woman turned her head slightly to the side, Eleanor's heart practically stopped. It was a face she knew intimately, the face of the daughter-in-law she had slapped and chased out of her house just 24 hours ago. It was Sylvia. Eleanor rubbed her eyes repeatedly, violently refusing to believe what she was seeing. How on earth could a penniless, uncultured girl, who walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back, gain access to the most exclusive event in New York City? How could she be wearing a dress that cost more than a Ferrari, radiating an aura of supreme, untouchable elegance? Eleanor's shock instantly morphed into a boiling, volcanic rage. Her wounded pride and sheer hatred completely blinded her common sense. She aggressively yanked Vance and Riley's arms, pushing roughly through the crowd of billionaires to march straight up to Sylvia. "Well, look who we have here," Eleanor practically shouted, her voice shrill and deliberate so that the surrounding elites would turn and look. She stopped right in front of Sylvia, looking her up and down with absolute disgust. "I never would have guessed a rat like you could sneak into a place like this. Let me guess. You're using your body to seduce some rich old man with one foot in the grave, aren't you? You shameless tramp. You run away from home because you're exposed as a useless wife, and now you're prowling for a sugar daddy among respectable people." Vance, standing beside his mother, let out a sneering laugh. The man felt a pathetic surge of superiority by degrading Sylvia. He looked at his ex-wife with total revulsion. "So this is why you had the guts to throw a plate and demand a divorce this morning? Because you already lined up a sponsor to fund your parasitic lifestyle? What a shame. It doesn't matter how expensive that dress is. It can't hide your low-class trash origins." Riley, not wanting to be outdone, crossed her arms, showing off her cleavage, and let out a mocking giggle. "So this is the woman you were always complaining about, Vance, honey? No wonder you preferred my bed. Her style is so dreadfully boring. She's trying to look pure, but honestly, she's just an eyesore at a high-class event like this. Security should really drag this overdressed beggar out to the curb." Sylvia stood perfectly still. There was no anger, no fear, and no sorrow on her flawlessly beautiful face. She simply listened in silence to the venom and insults spewing from the mouths of the three fools in front of her. Liam, standing just behind Sylvia, had already balled his fists, his earpiece ready to summon the tactical security team. But Sylvia raised her right hand just a fraction of an inch, signaling her trusted right-hand man to stand down. Sylvia looked at Eleanor, Vance, and Riley, her gaze as cold as liquid nitrogen. It was the exact same look she had given them right before she walked out of the dining room last night. "Are you three quite done barking?" Sylvia asked. her voice dangerously flat but cutting like a scalpel. You put on the only decent clothes you had left, rented a cheap town car, and dragged yourselves here to beg for a bailout. But instead of searching for someone to pull you out of your ocean of debt, you decide to pick a fight with the absolute wrong person. What a truly pathetic sight. Eleanor scoffed harshly and literally spat on the marble floor inches from Sylvia's designer heels. You've got some nerve trying to lecture us. We are here as officially invited VIPs. Unlike you, who clearly snuck in through the service elevator. Just wait until we meet the CEO tonight. We're going to get the capital to rebuild our empire. And when that happens, I am going to make you crawl on your hands and knees and beg at my feet. Sylvia simply offered a razor-thin smile, a smile loaded with devastating hidden meaning. In that case, please enjoy your lovely evening, Eleanor. The main event is about to begin. I am very much looking forward to seeing your reaction when you finally meet this CEO you're so proud to know. Exactly as Sylvia finished her sentence, the massive crystal chandeliers in the ballroom slowly dimmed. The string quartet stopped playing. The attention of every single guest instantly shifted toward the magnificent stage erected at the far end of the room. An impeccably dressed MC stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone. He asked the esteemed guests to direct their full attention to the stage, because the most anticipated moment of the night was at hand. The MC announced that tonight, for the very first time in corporate history, the elusive founder and supreme CEO of Sterling Global Enterprises would step out of the shadows and reveal themselves to the public. Hearing this announcement, Eleanor, Vance, and Riley instantly forgot Sylvia even existed. They frantically smoothed out their clothes, puffed out their chests, and glued their desperate, greedy eyes to the stage. They were preparing to grovel and kiss the boots of whatever powerful titan was about to walk up those stairs, praying they could win his sympathy and the millions of dollars they desperately needed. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the thin smile on the face of the woman standing right behind them was the final warning of the apocalypse that was about to wipe their existence off the map. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom dropped to a pin-drop silence. Hundreds of VIPs, the most powerful corporate warlords in America, held their breath. Everyone was desperate to see the face behind the myth, the mysterious architect who had built an invincible monopoly and controlled the nation's supply chains. The MC gave a brief, glowing introduction highlighting the company's aggressive, brilliant takeovers over the last few years, before finally inviting the CEO to step into the light. A blinding, brilliant spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a clear path from the side of the room directly to the stage stairs. Vance, Eleanor, and Riley stood on their tiptoes in the center of the crowd, craning their necks to get a good look at the figure walking down the aisle of light. Vance's heart was hammering against his ribs. He had already rehearsed a dozen brilliant elevator pitches in his head, ready to deploy the second he got within speaking distance of this corporate god. But as the highly anticipated figure stepped into the spotlight, time literally stopped for the Crawford family. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room, leaving them choking. The figure walking with absolute, terrifying authority down the illuminated path was not an intimidating old Wall Street veteran as they had imagined. The figure was wearing a breathtaking evening gown paired with an elegant silk scarf. Her footsteps were steady, the sharp click of her stilettos ringing out against the marble. Liam, the notoriously ruthless corporate fixer, feared across the financial district, walked 2 steps behind the woman, his head bowed in deep respect, ensuring no one dared to block his boss's path. The figure who was now the absolute center of attention, the entity that made hundreds of billionaires bow their heads in respect, was none other than Sylvia. Eleanor was the first to physically break under the weight of this horrifying reality. Her jaw unhinged, hanging wide open without a single sound coming out. Her eyes bulged out of their sockets, staring at the stage as if she had just watched a corpse rise from a casket. Her aged legs suddenly lost all bone density. Eleanor collapsed, her knees hitting the freezing marble floor with a thud. Her hands shook violently as she desperately tried to grab the hem of her son's jacket. But Vance was currently trapped in his own psychological hell. The man who had always believed himself to be a genius stood as rigid as a statue. His pale face had turned translucent. His mind became a chaotic whirlwind. Fragments of the past few years flashed rapidly behind his eyes. He remembered how his dying company miraculously received a massive, anonymous cash injection mere weeks after he married Sylvia. He remembered how massive, competitive government contracts simply fell into his lap with zero effort. In that blinding spotlight, Vance realized he had never been a business prodigy. He was nothing but a hollow puppet, animated by the strings his wife pulled from the shadows. Sylvia glided up the stairs with unmatched grace. She stood behind the grand acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of elites. She was no longer the submissive housewife who stared at the floor when screamed at. Standing up there was an apex predator, the absolute master of their fates. Sylvia adjusted the microphone and began her brief opening remark. Her voice was calm, dripping with authority, commanding the absolute submission of the room. She thanked her partners and officially introduced herself as Sylvia Sterling, the sole founder and owner of Sterling Global. A deafening roar of applause erupted through the ballroom, shaking the chandeliers everywhere except for the small epicenter of dread where the Crawford family stood paralyzed. When her brief speech concluded, Sylvia didn't leave the stage. She let the applause die down into a heavy silence. Her piercing eyes slowly swept across the crowd, hunting for the specific targets she had trapped. Sylvia's eyes locked dead onto Vance, who was violently trembling in the middle of the room. Her stare was glacial, signaling a lethal, inescapable doom. Meeting his ex-wife's eyes, Vance's mental defenses finally shattered into a million pieces. Overwhelming shame, unbridled terror, and utter despair melded into one. Vance realized that his only chance of surviving this financial execution was to beg for mercy, completely ignoring the stares of hundreds of billionaires and abandoning the pride he had valued above human life. Suddenly, Vance sprinted, shoving his way through the crowd. He pushed aside hedge fund managers and tech CEOs, ignoring their outraged shouts. He skidded to a halt right at the base of the stage, where two massive, armed security contractors crossed their arms, barring him from taking a single step up the stairs. Vance threw himself onto the floor, falling to his knees, and began sobbing hysterically. Snot and tears streamed down his face, utterly destroying his manicured appearance. "Sylvia, my sweet, darling wife," Vance wailed, his pathetic, hoarse voice echoing through the dead-silent ballroom. "Please, I beg you, forgive me. I was an idiot. I was blinded by my own ego. I didn't know you were the one saving me all this time. You are my guardian angel. I love you so much, Sylvia. I swear I'll be the perfect husband. I'll kick my mother out onto the street if that's what you want. Please. I am begging you. Save my company. Lift the sanctions. I am your husband, Sylvia." Hundreds of eyes stared at Vance in sheer disgust. Several executives began whispering, recognizing Vance as the idiot whose company had spectacularly imploded overnight. And now, they knew the real reason why he had been liquidated. Eleanor, still collapsed on the floor in the distance, could only cover her face with both hands, unable to bear the crushing weight of public humiliation. She realized she had violently slapped the hand that fed her, and now her golden boy was groveling like a dog beneath the shoes of the woman she spat on. Up on the stage, Sylvia looked down at the man sobbing at her feet with a face carved from stone. There was not a single drop of pity in her heart. She looked at Vance the way one looks at a diseased cockroach twitching on the pavement. Sylvia leaned into the microphone, ensuring her voice boomed through the speakers. "I am not your wife. The divorce papers were served this morning, and I have instructed my legal team to expedite the judgment," Sylvia declared, her tone severing any delusional hope Vance had left. "You have the audacity to ask to come back to me after you spent last night in a hotel with your mistress while your company bled to death? What a truly shameless proposal." Sylvia then glanced over at Liam, giving a sharp, subtle nod. "Liam, tell security to drag this man's mistress to the front of the stage. I want all the esteemed guests here tonight to see firsthand exactly what kind of high-classes woman convinced this fool to destroy his own life." The order was crystal clear. Two massive security guards immediately pushed into the crowd. They quickly spotted Riley, who was desperately trying to sneak out a side exit. Riley let out a terrified shriek as the guards grabbed her bare arms with a vice grip. She was forcibly dragged across the polished marble, surrounded by the mocking, judgmental stares of New York's elite, until she was thrown onto the floor right next to Vance, who was still weeping. The real game had just begun, and Sylvia was going to ensure every single lie was burned to the ground tonight. The atmosphere in the ballroom transformed into a high-stakes public tribunal. Every eye in the room was fixed on the woman who had just been tossed onto the floor. Riley thrashed wildly, trying to break free from the guards, but it was useless. Her expensive designer heels scraped loudly against the marble, a screeching sound that pierced the tense silence. The heavy jewelry she wore, which she always paraded as symbols of her extreme wealth, now looked like heavy shackles dragging a prisoner to the gallows. Her thick, glamorous makeup was melting down her face, ruined by a cold sweat. She kept screaming empty threats, screeching that she was the partner of a powerful billionaire and demanding they release her immediately. But nobody cared. The crowd looked at Riley with pure contempt, treating her like a stain on the exclusivity of the event. The guards let go of her roughly, sending her sprawling next to Vance. Riley winced in pain, frantically adjusting her slipping haute couture gown. She shot a venomous glare up at the stage, but the anger in her eyes instantly evaporated, replaced by paralyzing shock when she saw who was standing behind the podium. The puppet master controlling the room, the woman who commanded the respect of billionaires, was the exact same woman she had just called an overdressed beggar. Riley's breath hitched in her throat. Her mouth snapped shut. She realized she had walked blindly into a lethal trap with no exits. From the stage, Sylvia stared at the two pathetic creatures at her feet with the coldness of a glacier. There was no cheap, gloating smile on her face, only the absolute authority of a queen exterminating pests from her empire. Sylvia raised her hand, signaling Liam, who was standing near the AV control panel. Liam pressed a sequence of buttons. Instantly, a massive IMAX-sized projection screen descended from the ceiling behind the stage. The whirring of the motors broke the suffocating silence before the screen flashed bright white. Honored guests, Sylvia's voice echoed again, smooth but lethal. Tonight, I want to treat you all to a short presentation on deception and greed. Below this stage, you see a man who drove his own legacy off a cliff due to sheer arrogance. But his destruction wouldn't be complete without the woman cowering next to him. A woman who hid behind a mask of fake luxury to drain this idiot's bank accounts. The screen flashed, displaying a montage of highly classified financial documents. There were high-interest loan agreements stamped by predatory payday lenders and notorious loan sharks. The documents were blown up to massive proportions, revealing astronomical, unpayable debt figures. And the name printed in bold across every single page was Riley's. It didn't stop at loans. The screen shifted to display digital receipts. Receipts from Rent the Runway, for the exact Oscar de la Renta gown Riley was currently wearing. Rental contracts for the diamond necklace around her throat. Even an Avis receipt for the town car they had arrived in. Every single ounce of luxury Riley had ever bragged about, the fake wealth that made Eleanor worship her as a high society princess, was proven to be a total illusion. She owned absolutely nothing. She was drowning in debt that exceeded the value of her own life. Disgusted murmurs rippled through the crowd. The billionaires pointed at the massive screen and then sneered down at Riley. Riley covered her face with both hands, shaking violently from unbearable humiliation. She felt as though she had been stripped naked in Times Square. The darkest secrets she had spent years burying were now broadcasted to the most powerful people in America. She was finished. The loan sharks would see this on the news tomorrow and hunt her down like a dog. Vance, who had been weeping nonstop, suddenly stopped crying and stared up at the projection. His eyes bulged as he read the rental receipts and predatory loan balances. He turned his head to look at Riley in absolute, horrified disbelief. He felt as though he had been struck by lightning. For years, he had embezzled from his own company to buy Riley sports cars and penthouses because she convinced him she was a trust fund heiress who could elevate his social standing. He had betrayed his wife for this woman. But the reality was, he had been keeping a parasitic, blood-sucking leech who was dead broke and built on lies. Vance's voice trembled with a sudden, explosive rage. He scrambled to his feet and grabbed Riley by the arm, violently yanking her up. "You con artist," Vance screamed. "You told me your father was a hedge fund manager. You told me all those Birkins were real. You're just a broke street rat. Because of you, I drained my company's liquid cash. Because of you, I lost my wife and destroyed my own life. You lying bitch." Riley, feeling her arm being crushed, suddenly spun around. The crushing shame consuming her violently mutated into raw anger. She realized something much more critical than her humiliation. If Vance had lost his billionaire CEO wife, that meant Vance's company was truly dead. This man was no longer a walking ATM. He was just as broke as she was, perhaps even worse, given the corporate debt he was now personally liable for. Riley swung her free hand back and slapped Vance across the face with everything she had. The sickening smack echoed through the room. "Shut your mouth, you pathetic loser," Riley shrieked, her voice shrill and manic. "Did you really think I slept with you for love? I only wanted your credit cards. But look at you now. You're nothing but a piece of trash begging at your ex-wife's feet. You acted like you were a titan of Wall Street, but you were just a parasite feeding off your wife's bank account. You're broke. You're unemployed. Don't you ever dream I'd stay with a loser like you? A vicious physical fight broke out right in the middle of the Plaza Ballroom. Vance, refusing to be slapped and humiliated publicly, lunged at Riley. They pulled at each other, screaming the most vile, gutter-trash profanities ever heard in that historic venue. Eleanor, watching her son get attacked from afar, tried to run over to help. But her weak legs gave out, and she tripped, face-planting onto the marble floor. This pathetic, degrading spectacle was watched by the elite crowd with pure revulsion. The family that always preached about their high-class pedigree was now tearing each other apart like rabid animals in a gutter. Sylvia watched the chaos from her podium, her expression unmoving. She felt this circus had served its purpose for the night. She raised her hand one last time, signaling Liam. Liam tapped his earpiece. In a matter of seconds, a dozen heavily armed tactical security guards surged forward, surrounding Vance, Riley, and Eleanor. They grabbed the three of them by their collars and arms, showing zero mercy. Vance screamed and begged. Riley wailed hysterically. Eleanor thrashed and spat curses. But the guards didn't care. They dragged all three of them away from the stage, hauling them across the polished floor toward the grand exit doors. Sylvia watched impassively as their bodies were dragged out of sight, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind them, leaving a crisp, satisfying silence in the ballroom. The psychological torture was complete. Now, it was time for them to face the physical torture of the real world. The New York night air was freezing and unforgiving as Vance, Eleanor, and Riley were violently thrown out onto the concrete sidewalk of Fifth Avenue. The sickening thud of their bodies hitting the hard pavement was pathetic. The glass doors of the plaza locked firmly behind them, guarded by a wall of massive security personnel who glared at them, ensuring the trash didn't try to crawl back inside. Riley didn't waste a second. Crying hysterically and ignoring her bleeding, scraped knees, she scrambled up. She glared at Vance with pure venom, spat on the sidewalk near his designer shoes, and limped away into the darkness of Central Park South. She knew the loan sharks would be hunting her by dawn, and she needed to disappear immediately. Only Vance and Eleanor were left on the freezing concrete. They looked atrocious. Vance's custom Tom Ford jacket was ripped at the seam from being dragged, while Eleanor's hair looked like a bird's nest, her heavy makeup smeared black with tears. They sat on the curb in stunned silence, trying to process the absolute insanity that had completely obliterated their lives in a matter of hours. There was no rental car waiting for them. The driver had long since fled after hearing the whispers from the valet that his clients were deeply bankrupt and couldn't pay the bill. With the few crumpled dollar bills Vance had in his pocket, they were forced to take a filthy, late-night subway train back to Westchester. Throughout the long ride, exhausted commuters stared at the two bizarre figures dressed in ruined gala attire, exuding a foul stench of despair. The ride, which usually took no time, felt like a slow march to the electric chair. Vance's mind was blank. His soul felt completely severed from his body. He had lost his wife, the titan of the economy. He lost his company, his mistress, and worst of all, his entire reputation in front of every major player in the country. He was permanently blacklisted. No one would ever hire him, let alone do business with him. Meanwhile, Eleanor kept muttering nonsensical prayers under her breath, desperately hoping that when they got home, she would wake up in her plush California king bed and realize this was all just a terrible nightmare. But reality was infinitely crueler than any nightmare. When they finally dragged their feet off the train and walked into their gated community, Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes bugged out. She choked on her own breath as she stared at the scene in front of her. The heavy iron gates surrounding their mansion were wrapped in thick steel chains and heavily padlocked. Nailed directly to the center of the gate was a massive neon orange notice of foreclosure and immediate property seizure from the federal bank. The floodlights in the yard were blazing, revealing armed bailiffs and bank security officers patrolling the porch. But the detail that truly broke Eleanor's mind was the massive pile of garbage dumped on the asphalt right outside the gates. Clothes, shoes, framed family portraits, and Eleanor's prized collection of, now proven fake, designer handbags had been carelessly tossed onto the street. The items were piled haphazardly, many of them crushed and covered in street dirt. The bank had executed an emergency midnight seizure, acting on high-priority orders orchestrated by Sterling Global's network. The family was violently evicted, strictly forbidden from taking a single valuable item from the premises. "No, this is my house. This is my estate!" Eleanor shrieked, her raspy voice breaking the quiet suburban night. She limped frantically toward the pile of garbage on the street. She threw herself onto the rough asphalt, her trembling arms hugging her crushed handbags. "You have no right to take this house. We still have time. My son is going to pay everything. Give me back my house." The bank security guard standing behind the iron gate stared at her with absolute apathy. This property, and all its contents, are now officially owned by the federal bank to cover a microscopic fraction of your son's corporate debt. You are both strictly trespassing. Leave immediately, or we will have the police arrest you for disturbing the peace. Vance stood paralyzed a few steps behind his mother. He stared up at the massive columns of the mansion that used to symbolize his success. A house he bought with money his wife had secretly manipulated into his accounts. Now he truly had nowhere to sleep. The biting autumn wind cut right through his torn dress shirt, making him shiver violently. He watched his mother rolling around on the dirty street, crying over ruined bags, wailing like an absolute lunatic. It was right here that Vance finally understood that every single word his wife said last night was the absolute gospel truth. When Sylvia said they would lose everything, she wasn't playing games. They had literally lost everything, down to the last thread. Amidst Eleanor's pathetic wailing, the blinding LED headlights of a vehicle pierced the darkness from down the street. The sleek, elongated black Maybach glided silently down the upscale suburban road. The luxury SUV came to a smooth stop directly across the street, facing the pile of garbage Eleanor was hugging. The rear-tinted window slowly rolled down. From the shadows of the back seat, Sylvia's face emerged, bathed calmly in the glow of the streetlights. She looked at her ex-husband and mother-in-law with an utterly hollow expression. There was no pity. There was no gloating smirk. Just the look of someone staring at roadkill. Eleanor stopped her sobbing and looked up at her daughter-in-law's face. Her mouth hung open, wanting to scream a curse, but her vocal cords refused to work. Pure, unadulterated terror and crushing regret finally began to eat away at her soul. Sylvia didn't speak a single word. She simply reached her hand covered in an elegant silk glove out the window. She opened her palm and dropped a single silver quarter. The coin hit the asphalt with a sharp clink, bouncing a few times before rolling slowly to a stop right against Eleanor's scraped knee. The metallic ringing was crystal clear in the dead of night. It was a gesture of supreme disrespect, infinitely more painful than 1,000 screamed curses. "Take it," Sylvia said, her voice soft but echoing perfectly in the silence. "Use it to call a shelter tonight. Consider it a thank you for the valuable lesson you both taught me." As soon as the words left her lips, the tinted window rolled back up, sealing her away. The massive engine purred, and the Maybach glided forward, disappearing into the night, taking Sylvia toward her brilliant, limitless future. Vance and Eleanor were left behind, swallowed by the darkness, the freezing cold, and the endless suffering that had only just begun. They stared at the shiny quarter on the asphalt, realizing that karma had come to collect its debt in the most brutal way possible, grinding their arrogance into dust beneath the very feet they used to trample on. The Manhattan Family Court building stood tall and intimidating the next morning, radiating a stern judicial authority that no one dared to question. The massive marble pillars holding up the facade stood as silent witnesses to the thousands of lives destroyed or saved behind its heavy oak doors. The corridors of the courthouse were freezing cold. The polished terrazzo floors echoed with the rapid footsteps of aggressive lawyers carrying stacks of litigation files. In one of the dead-silent waiting areas, Vance sat hunched over, his physical and mental state entirely obliterated. He looked nothing like the hotshot CEO from 48 hours ago. His shirt was a wrinkled, stained mess. His face was covered in a patchy, unkempt stubble, and his eyes were swollen completely shut from a lack of sleep and endless, pathetic crying. He had no lawyer with him. Not a single defense attorney in New York was willing to represent a man whose company had imploded with a multi-billion-dollar deficit. He came alone, facing the bitter reality that he was about to be legally stripped of everything. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open, signaling his case was up. Vance dragged his feet inside, feeling as if 100-pound iron weights were shackled to his ankles. The courtroom was massive, paneled and dark, imposing mahogany. At the front, the judge's bench loomed high above, meant to intimidate anyone sitting at the defendant's table. Vance sat down at the respondent's desk, his hands shaking uncontrollably. A moment later, the rear doors opened again. The sharp, authoritative click of high heels immediately made Vance's heart hammer against his ribs. He turned and saw Sylvia walk in with breathtaking elegance. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal pantsuit, exuding pure corporate dominance. Behind her, Liam walked with the hyper-vigilance of a Secret Service agent, followed by a phalanx of the most expensive, ruthless litigators in the state, carrying briefcases packed with undeniable evidence. Sylvia sat at the petitioner's table across from Vance. She didn't even glance in his direction. She sat with perfect posture, staring straight ahead at the judge's bench with total serenity. Her mere presence sucked all the oxygen out of the room, making Vance choke. He swallowed hard, realizing the infinite, insurmountable chasm that now separated him from the woman he used to treat like trash. The presiding judge entered, slammed the gavel, and commenced the proceedings. Unlike typical high-net-worth divorces that dragged on for years, this hearing was brutally swift and entirely one-sided. Sylvia's legal team laid out the evidence with surgical precision. They submitted the forensic audits of Vance's catastrophic losses, the mountains of debt, and sworn affidavits proving Vance had exactly 0 assets left to his name. Every argument delivered by Sylvia's lawyers was a nail hammered deep into the coffin of Vance's future. Vance just sat there, mute. When the judge asked if he had any defense or objection to the dissolution, Vance's mouth remained glued shut. He knew anything he said was entirely pointless. He had lost the war before the first shot was even fired. The judge read the final ruling in a loud, commanding voice. The marriage was legally terminated, effective immediately. Sylvia was absolved of any and all spousal support or debt liability. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel officially finalized Vance's expulsion from the billionaire's universe. The entire legal execution took less than 20 minutes. As the judge left the bench, Sylvia's lawyers packed up their files. Sylvia stood up, preparing to leave without saying a word. But before she could reach the aisle, Vance suddenly scrambled out of his chair and sprinted toward her. He threw himself onto the courtroom floor, groveling directly at the tips of Sylvia's Louboutins. Both of his hands clamped tightly around her ankles, and he sobbed with a raspy, pathetic wail that bounced off the mahogany walls. His pride was absolutely, unequivocally dead. "Sylvia, please, just listen to me for 1 second," Vance begged, his tears soaking the floor. "I accept the judge's ruling. I know I'm a piece of shit. But please, I am begging you for just an ounce of mercy. Take my name off the industry blacklist. The house is gone. The company is dead. If I can't even get a job, how am I supposed to eat? I swear I will never show my face to you again. Just let me get a job so I don't starve." Sylvia stood perfectly still like a marble statue. She looked down at the man groveling like a worm with eyes as cold as the Arctic. Liam immediately stepped forward, ready to physically rip Vance off his boss and throw him across the room. But Sylvia raised a hand, ordering Liam to step back. She let Vance cry and wail for several agonizing seconds before she violently jerked her leg back, breaking his grip. "You are asking me for mercy?" Sylvia's voice shattered the silence. It was low, but vibrating with the remnants of a dormant fury. "Do you remember what you did when your mother slapped me across the face in front of your entire family? You leaned back, crossed your arms, and laughed at me. You told me I was a useless peasant that you were generous enough to pick up off the street. Where was your mercy then, Vance?" Vance bowed his head even lower, his forehead touching the floor. He shook violently, trying to formulate an apology, but the words died in his throat. Sylvia's voice grew even sharper. "You laughed so hard when I was suffering. You thought you were a god who held my life in your hands. I simply put us back in our rightful places. That blacklist is permanent. Every corporate door in this country is welded shut to you forever. I suggest you conserve your tears, Vance, because your suffering is just getting started." After delivering his final sentence, Sylvia turned her back. She walked out of the courtroom with her spine perfectly straight, her head held high, and her steps unwavering. Liam and the legal team followed, leaving Vance curled up in a ball on the cold courtroom floor. He pounded his bloody fists against the tiles, screaming in agony over his own monumental stupidity. He finally realized that the deepest remorse in the world couldn't alter reality. The woman he thought was weak was actually the grim reaper of his destiny, and absolutely nothing on earth could pull him out of the grave he dug for himself. 6 months had passed since the hurricane of destruction wiped the Crawford family off the map. Time marched on, bringing massive changes to those who chose to rise. In the penthouse office of a glittering Wall Street skyscraper, the global headquarters of Sterling Global, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating a breathtakingly luxurious workspace. Sylvia sat in her imposing leather CEO chair behind a massive mahogany desk. She looked more radiant, powerful, and mesmerizing than ever. She exuded the calm, lethal wisdom possessed only by true apex predators of industry. Sitting across from her was a sharply dressed man pitching a massive cross-continental acquisition strategy. It was Harrison Cole, a brilliant, self-made tech billionaire who built his empire from the ground up with sweat and ruthless honesty. Unlike the manipulative shadows of Sylvia's past, her dynamic with Harrison was built purely on mutual respect and intellectual equality. Harrison deeply admired Sylvia's terrifying ability to read global markets, while Sylvia respected Harrison's transparent, cutthroat work ethic. They debated intensely, bouncing ideas off each other and mapping out global strategies. Occasionally, Harrison would let out a booming laugh at one of Sylvia's dry, razor-sharp jokes. There was no fake dominance here, no disgusting, fragile male ego to coddle. In this room, Sylvia had finally found the environment she always deserved. A place where her genius was fully unleashed without having to wear a mask of subservience. She had taken her empire to heights previously thought impossible, proving that a woman whose dignity was once trampled could spread her wings and eclipse the sun. Meanwhile, in a completely different corner of the state, far from the glittering skyscrapers and billionaire deals, reality showed its most vicious face. In a decaying Rust Belt town in upstate New York, buried under the gloom of poverty, sat a grimy, grease-stained diner that served exhausted truck drivers and factory workers. The air was thick with the smell of burnt frying oil, backed-up sewage, and the deafening roar of passing 1-8-wheelers. In the sweltering, filthy back kitchen of the diner, right next to an industrial sink coated in black sludge, a middle-aged man was hunched over in an incredibly pathetic state. His uniform was a ragged, stained t-shirt covered in rancid grease and food slop. His skin was leathery and burnt from the heat. His body was emaciated, and his hair had gone completely gray years prematurely. The miserable man was Vance. Ever since his name was blasted onto Sterling Global's permanent blacklist, not a single corporation, startup, or even mid-level office in the country would even look at his resume. He was chased out of lobbies and cursed at every time he begged for an entry-level desk job. To avoid starving to death on the street, Vance had to swallow the shattered pieces of his pride and take the absolute lowest form of back-breaking manual labor he could find. He was now a dishwasher in this rotting diner. His hands, which used to be manicured and soft, were now covered in thick calluses, blisters, and deep cuts from broken glass and toxic industrial dish soap. He worked from the crack of dawn until past midnight, just to earn a minimum wage payout that wasn't even enough to buy one of the fancy appetizers he used to throw in the trash. As Vance aggressively scrubbed a massive charred frying pan, his mind drifted. He hallucinated about the warmth of his Westchester mansion, the feeling of his bespoke suits, and the face of his ex-wife. The daydream caused him to lose focus. His hands, slick with cheap soap, fumbled, and a heavy ceramic diner plate slipped from his grasp. The plate hit the hard concrete floor and shattered into dozens of pieces. The loud crash pierced through the chaotic noise of the kitchen. Hearing the sound of breaking plates, the diner's owner, a massive, terrifyingly aggressive man covered in tattoos, stormed into the dish pit. He glared at the shattered ceramic on the floor with bulging veins. Without waiting for Vance to utter a single excuse, the massive owner raised his meaty hand and slapped Vance across the face with devastating force. The crack of the slap echoed over the fryers. Vance was thrown backward, his spine slamming painfully into the edge of the filthy sink. His cheek burned with agonizing pain, his ears ringing loudly. "You stupid, incompetent man," the owner bellowed, his voice so loud the truckers in the front of the diner went quiet. "You can't even wash dishes without breaking my shit. Are you trying to put me out of business? You're lucky I pulled your starving ass out of the gutter. I'm docking your pay for that plate. Clean up this mess right now." Those words felt like 1,000 rusted nails driven directly into Vance's heart. It was the exact same phrasing, the exact same scenario his mother had put Sylvia through on the night his life ended. Karma had come to collect the absolute maximum penalty, leaving zero change. Vance didn't fight back. The man who used to believe he was a god among men simply lowered his eyes to the floor. Bitter, agonizing tears of ultimate regret streamed down his filthy cheeks. He dropped to his knees on the slippery, rotting concrete floor. He picked up the sharp shards of broken ceramic with his bare, shaking hands. He swallowed the total humiliation, finally realizing this was the life he had earned. This living hell was his permanent, inescapable home. Not too far from the diner, near the city's massive, overflowing municipal landfill, an equally horrifying scene played out. Amongst the mountains of rotting garbage and toxic waste that reeked of decay, an elderly woman in filthy, torn rags was aggressively digging through the trash. She was pushing a rusted shopping cart with a broken wheel. Her face was coated in thick layers of grime and black soot. She was hoarding soggy cardboard boxes, crushed plastic bottles, and aluminum cans to trade for pennies at the recycling plant. The deranged homeless woman was Eleanor. Eleanor's sanity had completely snapped months ago. Ever since the night she was thrown out of her mansion, her brain violently rejected the reality of her poverty. As she dug through the putrid trash, her mouth constantly mumbled insane, delusional ramblings. She spoke to empty bleach bottles as if they were her diamond necklaces. She hugged rotting, stained cardboard boxes, telling herself they were imported Hermes bags. She aggressively shouted at passing stray dogs and homeless addicts, bragging about how brilliant her CEO's son was and how massive her estate was. Even though people only looked at her with disgust and labeled her a raving lunatic, her inherent greed and arrogance had fully rotted her brain, condemning her to spend the rest of her miserable life surrounded by literal garbage. The universe's justice system always finds a way to balance the scales. This story serves as a brutal warning for anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear. Never step on those who choose to remain silent and patient. Their patience is not a weakness to be exploited, because when that patience finally runs out, and their dignity is pushed past the point of no return, the retaliation they unleash will be apocalyptic. They will make sure you have nowhere left to hide. And a living hell is the only destination they will leave behind for those who betrayed them.